we're starting to get into theology, in the sense we're going to start hitting our subjects. And we begin with very dense material. Although, I'll just going to kind of throw you to the wolves, as it were. A lot of the stuff you're going to have to go and read. But if you're reading Milne, he'll be good. But there's a lot of, in our staff meeting this morning, some of the stuff we'll talk about today kind of came up when you asked questions about Jesus and dying and being God and things like that. So, with that said, let's pray and then do our best to stay on track with our material. Father, we thank you for revealing yourself to us, and we thank you that you are great and your greatness is unsearchable. Help us to explore as far as we can go the mystery and the majesty of your person. And may it be life transforming, intellectually stimulating, and may it open us up to awe and wonder. In Jesus' name, who is the focal point of your revelation. Amen. Okay, today we are going to have the first installment of a subject, so next week we'll pick up on the same subject. So today we asked the question, what is God like? What is God like? Who sings that song? What if God were one of us? Just a slob like one of us? Just a stranger on a bus trying to find his way home? Yeah. But that's the question. My goodness. What is God like? It's one thing to say that God exists, but it's another thing to have the audacity to define who he is and to describe who he is. And so as we come to consider the question of what God is like, really it's a question of massive importance. Because here when we talk about the nature and the essence and the character of God and his relationship to a world, which God being infinite, immaterial, creator, spirit, and his relationships to things that are everything but that, in the sense we are material, we do have spirit, but we're not infinite, we're finite, we are creation. And so as we try in our mind to put these two categories together, we run into a lot of issues. How does this majestic being relate to a world that is so limited? And here, when we talk about the nature and the doctrine of God, the highways of biblical interpretation and philosophical reflection intersect. You guys know what I mean by that? What I'm trying to say is this: when we're doing our theology, we're interpreting the Bible, right? Yet because we are being rational in this and using our minds, we also have to engage in philosophy. In other words, worldview. How do I see things? How do things make sense? What is the nature and essence of things? What is the logical reasoning behind something? And so the highways intersect here, actually in all of biblical interpretation to a degree, but especially here when we talk about the nature of God. Because the Bible says stuff, but then we have to go, well, philosophically though, as I try to think about the nature of God, how does that work? And you'll see what I mean. But so basically, we're going to try and bridge these two worlds in a healthy and appropriate manner. And here's why. As we consider a being, meaning God, who is great and beyond comparison and without limits, and who encompasses all things, we are left with a lot of deep reflection to do. He's huge. And even huge isn't totally appropriate, because huge implies some sort of defined boundary, which God doesn't have any defined boundaries. And this should in turn result in worship. I mean, you cannot study the doctrine of God without being lifted to the loftiest expressions of joy. If it doesn't affect your heart, there's something wrong, not just with the approach, but there's some disconnect as you consider the vastness and the greatness of Yahweh. So we consider his vast worth, his beauty and his excellence, and it results in worship. So I have a few verses to kind of help us get that frame of mind. And actually these verses we could sit here and discuss probably for the next 6 hours. They're so meaty as we would to unpack them. But just get the gist of what his greatness should do. It should result in praise. Romans 11, verse 33 through 36. By the way, this is right after Paul has laid out some of the most controversial and complicated theology in all of the Bible. And Paul says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord?" Tuesdays, huh? So, notice, how unsearchable are his judgments? Paul has just, to some degree, searched out quite a bit of what God's been doing with Israel, electing and hardening and all that very complicated and debated theology. His judgments are unsearchable, and his ways are inscrutable. You can't scrutinize them. You can't get the microscope out and try to fine-tooth comb through everything. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has become his counselor? Or who has given a gift that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things, to him be glory forever and ever. So us as finite creatures, temporal, spatio-time oriented creatures, what Paul is saying, all things come from him, they come through him, and they go to him. And it's played out on the arena or the stage of the world. In other words, what Paul is saying is, we do have some idea of what God has been doing, sufficient. But listen, at some point we have to admit and confess he's much bigger, and his ways are much deeper, and his judgments are unsearchable. Especially if you know the context of Romans 9 through 11, it makes sense that Paul would say that. Then 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 17. Now to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, to God who alone is wise, be glory and honor forever and ever. Amen. Eternal, immortal, and invisible. All these things are not natural to humanity. We're not eternal, we are not immortal, and we are not invisible. Yet God, each of these things can and should be, because it's rightful to do, attributed to him. So what we're talking about when we talk about the nature of God, we're talking about his essence and his attributes. So when you think about the attributes of God and his character and his ways, any attempt to describe him or define him is daunting. It just is. Yet if you think about it, what are all religions about? Every religion seeks to explain the meaning of life, why we're here, how we got here, evil and suffering in the world, and all of these very important issues. And religions set out to define who God is, what he is like, and based on that, how one should live their life. So if you are a Hindu, you will have a very different approach to how you handle suffering and what you think happens to you after you die. And that will affect the way that you live and the way that you even treat other people. Because for all you know, they're being punished for something in a past life. Because your religion has defined what God is, and he's impersonal in Eastern religions. But so all religions try to define God, what he is like, and how we should ethically order our lives in light of that. Depending on how you understand God, you will behave in a certain way. Now, the source of your knowledge will shape the content of your understanding. So what's the source of our understanding of God? The Bible. Okay. Now, the question comes, how much should we employ philosophy in the quest to understand the nature of God? And what weight should we give to it when we try to describe the nature of God? Or what are the philosophical assumptions that are correct and that should determine our conclusions? All that to say, even as we have our philosophical approaches, we should be fine to let the Bible leave us with a healthy dose of mystery that leads to reverential awe and worship. It's not about setting out neat and tight parameters about God. Worship is the end goal. Okay, so all that by way of introduction. So first of all, when we talk about what is God like, first of all, we would have to say several things about him, right? And the first thing that we could say about God would be what? God exists. He is. Or as God says it, I am. So when we talk about the existence of God, this is what we're going to do. We're going to, first of all, talk about what the Bible says. We'll talk about his independent existence. We'll consider some arguments for the existence of God. And we will briefly touch on evil and suffering. Okay? So that's where we're going in this section. Now, the first thing that we should say is that the Bible does not try to prove the existence of God. The Bible does not even necessarily try to defend the existence of God, but rather what the Bible is doing is assuming the existence of God and defining Yahweh as the only one real God. So the Bible assumes the existence of God, and its argumental motif is to say that Yahweh is God and not Baal or some other god. Okay? So before we even talk about the different arguments that we would consider for the existence of God, we have to be very clear that we're not relying on these arguments apart from biblical revelation. The arguments are good. But listen, the Bible isn't concerned with this. The Bible works from the assumption that God exists. Okay? The Bible works from the assumption that God exists. Now, if we want to use arguments for God's existence, what would we call that? What area is that? Apologetics, right. And evangelism. Basically, we are trying to clear the way for people that have doubts about God's existence. And so it's very useful. But we don't need to always begin there. You know, if you go to a Muslim country, you're not going to say, well, look at that mosque. It has design. Somebody must have designed it. That designer, my friend, is God. Or, you know, the argument works like this. Haven't you noticed how this mountain has design? A Muslim's going to say, what are you talking about? I believe in God. You're the one that's all messed up. You believe in 3 gods, and you believe he had a son, and that his son was God, and that he died. So the arguments, the philosophical arguments for the existence of God are useful in bridging intellectual and logical gaps between skepticism and belief in the reality of God. And that's more and more prevalent in the Western world, but if the further east you go, those aren't the issues you're going to be dealing with. So don't make those the beginning of every evangelistic conversation, is what I'm trying to say. Or the only reason we bring them up now is because we do live in a world where atheism and skepticism is prevalent. But what we have to be clear about is that whether or not the arguments are good, and we could debate that. I personally, I'm not the hugest fan. I think they're useful, but I mean, I'm not the hugest fan of them. The Bible does say God exists, and it argues from and not for the existence of God. And that ultimately it is a matter of faith. You're not going to argue somebody into a logical corner and convert them. That might be used, but that's not the all in all. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists. So you've got to have faith that God exists. Okay, so first of all, the Bible assumes the existence of God. We just need to know that, okay? The Bible is a dogmatic book. Now, when we talk about the existence of God, we consider the fact of his aseity. And what this means is his self-existence. His self-existence. The word aseity is derived from the Latin ase, which means from oneself. Okay? Sorry. From oneself. That is this. God's existence is from himself. Aseity, as a divine attribute, refers to God's self-existence. In other words, God is not dependent upon anything. God is not dependent upon anything else for existence, but eternally, without beginning and without end, exists. There's nothing before he existed. There's nothing simultaneous with his coming into existence, because why? You glazed over?
Yeah, well, because he's God, he cannot
Uh-huh. So when did God come into existence? Okay, never. Okay. So there were no angels that helped him. He didn't evolve. Nothing like that. He eternally is who he is, without beginning, without end. And his existence comes from himself. You know, if you want to say he's self-caused, or however you want to put it. But he does not depend on anything He's absolutely independent from all things at all times. God has life in himself, and he exists by himself independently. Okay? So, God exists by himself, and he's alive, right? He's a living being. And that life is in himself. Again, he doesn't derive it from any foreign source. He is life itself. John chapter 5, verse 26, for as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. I mean, this is pretty plain, right? You guys get it? But the idea is all other forms of life have a beginning. They have something that has caused their existence, but not God. So God, as we'll see with the arguments for his existence, can be what we would call the uncaused causer. Everything else has a cause except for God. He is uncaused. We will also explore the idea of the solitariness of God, coming from this idea. His independent self-existence, imperfection, and completeness. Huge, huge ideas. Independent self-existence, imperfection, and completeness. Meaning, when he made the world, it wasn't because there was something that he needed. There was no imperfection, no need, no lack, nothing that he was trying to fill. You guys all right so far? Okay, Acts chapter 17, verse 24 and 25. Paul saying to the philosophers in Greece, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. So, the implications of this are massive. First of all, God has no need. None. Not a single iota of lack or need. 2, when God created the world, it wasn't to meet any need that he had. He wasn't lonely. He wasn't sad. He wasn't trying to, meet some need of fellowship.
Not even the need to be worshipped.
Right. Even our worship doesn't add to him. Thirdly, God didn't make man because he needed man. He didn't make man because he was lonely or he had some sort of lack. Okay? You heard those preachers. God was so lonely, and so he made man, and then man turned from him and broke his heart. And now God is just another country song. It doesn't work like that. God was not lonely. Fourthly, now listen to this, God answers to nobody. Nobody can tell God what you need to answer to me with this. Sure, we have prayers of man wrestling with God, but that doesn't mean that God is obligated or accountable or anything to anybody. Okay? So God answers to nobody. Fifthly, he has no equal. God has no equal. Satan is not God's equal. I hope we all know that. Satan is a created subordinate to God, and in all things he remains that way. He is a created being, not an equal. And God at any moment could cause Satan's existence to cease. Sixthly, God can do what he wants, when he wants, how he wants. So are you saying God could lie? God wouldn't want to lie. He cannot lie because it's not in his nature, and so therefore he wouldn't want to lie. Therefore, he does what he wants, when he wants, how he wants. He'll never want to lie. So it's an absurd question. Okay, but do you see the picture we're setting of God? He's not limited to our theology textbooks, even though they help us understand him. He is, in some sense, let me step out on a limb here, he's not limited to what the Bible says about him. He didn't tell us everything there is to know. Now, does that mean that there's knowledge outside the Bible that God has given to other religions? No. Does that mean that there's things about him that are contradictory to what the Bible says? No. But he is not limited by his sufficient yet incomplete revelation of himself. It's complete for his purposes, but it's not everything. Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord. He's kept secrets from us because we don't need to know them. Okay. 7. He exists out of necessity or undeniably. He is what we call a necessary being. He's not a potential being. He is a necessary being. His existence is a necessity. It's undeniable. It's impossible for God to not exist. And he is the only necessary being that there is. Sound good? Okay. So that's just kind of all here under the idea of God's aseity, which we'll come back to a little bit later in one way or another. So now, but yet we live in a world where all that is not believed, right? So my least favorite part of the class is what we're going to do now, okay? So let's talk about some arguments for the existence of God. Let me preface it by saying this. Philosophical and logical arguments for God's existence are not equal to Scripture, okay? Got to remember that. Yet they do serve a purpose and they do have a value. William Lane Craig, he says that Alvin Plantinga, who is a philosopher, a Christian philosopher, says there are around 24 arguments for the existence of God. I'm not good at math, but I know that's about 24. So 24 arguments for the existence of God. Now that's obviously more than we're going to consider today. Quite a few more. But let me just highlight a few of these and say that these belong to what we would call natural theology. We're talking about reason and philosophy. Come again? Yes. Arguments for the existence of God. So there's several strands of what is called the cosmological, but relying mainly on Craig here and his thick book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. There is, first of all, the cosmological argument, okay? There's the Kalam, or the Kalam, the Thomist, and the Leibnizian. But I'm going to focus on the Kalam, or Kalam, however you pronounce it, because it's simple and logical. So this one is from causality. You guys already heard this probably? Huh? Okay, good. then I don't have to spend a lot of time. Whatever begins to exist is caused. Number 2, second premise. The universe began to exist. Third, the universe has a cause, and then obviously the assumption then God is that cause, even though scientists would say why. Now, when you think about this, here's what I like about this. This argument itself doesn't say God created the world, but that it makes sense that the world came into being, and there has to be an explanation for that. And because we can't argue back and 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 say this was caused by that, 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 it has to stop somewhere. That's called an infinite regress. It can't do that. It's got to stop somewhere. But here, let's be honest. Does that have to be the God of the Bible? No. But it would make sense that it's an intelligent causer, a personal causer, because personal things have come in. Personality cannot be created by non-personal things. Ultimately, that personal information comes from something that's a person. So there's two things here. First of all, did the universe begin to exist? And what can we say about this hypothetical or potential causer of the universe? So, the universe began to exist. Scientists who hold to the Big Bang have said that the universe is not eternal, but that it came into being a finite time ago. And that it was not the effect of prior physical events. Okay? So that's what scientists have said. So, the universe began to exist. That's, even Richard Dawkins admits that. Although he, I'm not a scientist. But so the universe began to exist. Secondly, there's something called the second law of thermodynamics. You guys heard about that? The law of entropy. Things naturally decay and they break down. That energy unharnessed is not productive. In other words, the world is subject to decay. It is tending towards death. Now, if the universe were eternal, then why would it not be in an eternal state of death? Also, movement that happens in our spatio-temporal world implies that there's limitation and boundaries. And they've actually found what they say is the edge of the universe, right? Yeah, the universe is expanding. The expanding universe is one of the things that they talk about to show that it had a beginning, because the movement and growing, it can't be eternal. Eternal things don't grow. Now, what about the cause? So if the universe began to exist, because listen, this argument here, in order for it to work, this premise has to be true. Did the universe begin to exist? Okay? Scientists would say yes, at least honest ones. So then, the universe has a cause. So we're getting close to God, but we're not there yet, right? We got to say, is he the cause? We would say yes. We would read Genesis 1 and say yes. But does that prove by itself the existence of God? Again, the best thing that this does is it tells us you can't have an infinite regress. It's got to stop somewhere. And this cause has to be intelligent and personal and powerful and uncaused himself. Okay, so that is the cosmological argument. You can tell I get really excited about these. So the next one is the teleological argument. And here we're talking about design and purpose. So it works like this. Where you see design, that implies there was a designer. The universe manifests design. Third, therefore, there must be a designer. So, what is the important part of this premise? The second one. Does the universe manifest design? That's the question. So in order for this argument to be a sound argument, the second premise must be demonstrable. Can we observe the universe and conclude that there is evidence of design? So the following observations would suggest so. Okay. First of all, William Paley, do you guys know who that is? He wrote a book about natural theology. William Paley was responding to the Enlightenment, and he said that if somebody were to go into an empty field and they were to find a watch, they would write and they would conclude that there was a watchmaker who had made it. It's too complex. Too many things have to be put together in composite ways, the right way for it to function. Right? Obviously designed and has functional intentionality.
Is that the same thing as the fine-tuning?
Yeah. Which we'll talk about. So, scientists, according to Craig, have been stunned to discover how complex and sensitive a nexus, which is a connection or series of connections linking things, of initial conditions must be given in order for the universe to permit the origin and evolution of intelligent life. Okay? How complex and sensitive the situation must have been for the initial conditions to permit the origin of intelligent life. Norm Geisler says this: the universe is a very intricate system of forces that work together for the mutual benefit of the whole. Life is a very complex development. A single DNA molecule, the building block of all life, carries the same amount of information as one volume of an encyclopedia. No one seen an encyclopedia lying in the forest would hesitate to think that it had an intelligent cause. With all that information, you would say, somebody had this information and they codified it and they put it in this book. A single DNA cell has just as much information. Logic would say somebody put that information there. Then you have what is called the fine-tuning of the universe. Okay? Now, again from Craig, the physical laws of nature, when given mathematical expression, contain various constants or quantities, such as the gravitational constant, it's always happening, or the density of the universe, whose values are not mandated by the laws, right? These laws, they're not mandated by the laws themselves, and a universe governed by such laws might be characterized by any of a wide range of such variables. By fine-tuning, one typically means that the actual values assumed by the constants and quantities in question are such, here's the main sentence, I know it's a lot of difficult language, small deviations from those values would render the universe life prohibiting. In other words, our universe is so tuned and placed in the galaxies that in order for life to survive on the earth, there's very small variations in these situations would make it impossible. I don't know what the exact thing is, but if we were a little bit closer to the sun, it'd be too hot. If we were a little bit further away from the sun, it'd be too cold. So that's the fine-tuning of the universe. Now let me tell you, the guy that came up with this, his name's Rod. Do you guys want his article? I can send it to you. He's from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And they have a philosophy teacher, I can't remember his name either, who just obviously not a believer in God. And he took this and he says, okay, let's break this down. And his conclusion about the fine-tuning of the universe was, he goes, because then what the author of it says is, a loving God must have put us here. And there's an illustration of a bomb, being told that there was a bomb in a room to get you out. I'll send you guys it's about 6 pages. But so the philosopher, if I can remember, I'm doing this just off the top of my head, he goes, well, of course everything is in place perfectly for life to exist, because we exist. And we wouldn't be able to be here and talk about it if it wasn't like that. But that doesn't mean that somebody did it. Okay? Philosophers will find a way out of everything. Just so you know. As soon as you want to attach God very strongly to things, philosophers will find a way. That's why there's limits to this. Because this shows, what do these things show us? It's very rational to believe in God. Very rational. That's what these arguments do. They show us that logically belief in God is actually the most rational thing. Okay, one more. And this is called the moral argument. Have you guys heard of this one? The moral argument. Right? So it's like this. Moral law. What does that imply? Right, that there is a moral law giver. Moral law exists. So, thus, there is a moral law giver. Now, this gets into ethics, and it's interesting in a postmodern context. What are morals? Who determines what they are? Now, we live in a day where most people, at least intellectuals and even people that aren't intellectuals, but that they are just people who have worldview presuppositions, they're relativists, meaning truth is relative, morals are relative, there's no absolutes, obviously, except for the fact that relativism is an absolute. It's self-defeating. But so in this, there's no ability to call anything wrong or right in a pure sense. And thus, culture and community create their own private paradigm that nobody can challenge. Now, this breaks down not only in international conflicts, but ultimately, to the tiniest degree, one could say, well, I feel that this thing is right for me, and you can't tell me it's wrong. Because morals are relative. Ethics and governmental jurisdiction demands that there is some standard of right and wrong. So cultural relativism breaks down, then what in the world is the United Nations for? What's the United Nations even there for? What's the whole point of the Security Council? And resolving conflicts. What are we saying in those? So when Israel and Hezbollah had something going, or when there's some other conflict going, they're saying somebody's right and somebody's wrong. Okay? They're assuming that there is such a thing. Now, I was listening to a podcast. These guys, it's a friend of mine listens, so I checked it out. It's called How Stuff Works. How Stuff Works. And it talks about a lot of different stuff, like migraines, deja vu, and kind of weird stuff. But so they brought up, somehow they got into relativism. And the Incas and the Mayans came up. And so the guy, he admitted, he goes, but to them that was right. The human sacrifices and stuff. And he goes, so I think cultural relativism is true. He goes, I don't like, what they did, but I can't say that they were wrong for doing it. Because that was a different culture. And so now you would have, relativism breaks down in every form, because then as time passes, if you were to go, well, now we've arrived at a certain morality, and we can say that's wrong. But you don't have any grounds for saying that, because 20 years from now, people can look back and say, what you're doing is wrong. And they might go, yeah, because morality is relative. So that's kind of the world that we live in, where there is no moral law. Even though government assumes it, international legislative bodies, they assume it. Listen to this from Douglas Grotius. Do you guys remember 9/11? Right? Okay. The New York Times, he says, proclaimed that events like the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks on America cry out for a transcendent ethical standard. Because obviously, you don't fly your planes into our buildings. That's wrong. Okay. So these things make us cry out for a transcendent, meaning above, beyond human scope, ethical standard that is not available in the fashionable postmodern relativism of the academy, which says there are no absolute right and wrong. Yet, the fashionable option is still ethical relativism. I mean, you want to talk about an oxymoron or just a flat-out contradiction on a huge scale. There could be a minor scale ethical relativism, the trolley problem, if you guys know what that is. Who do you save? 2 people on that track or 5 on that? Oh wait, but one of them's your brother. All these different psychological scenarios. Yet, ethical relativism, which claims that moral judgments are dependent on contingent, social, and historical agreements. Morality is merely human. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Morality is contingent and revisable according to the postmodern mind. Okay? One person's terrorist, they were our terrorists, but for extreme Muslims who they represented, they were freedom fighters. So, if I grew up in Afghanistan, a small village, all I'd ever known was the Quran and Islam. And I, adhere to what we would call extreme Islam. And I look at 9/11 and I say, that was a good and righteous thing. Okay? Then I'm some cornbread, white-skinned kid from Kentucky or from Ohio. And 3 things are important to me. Maybe 4. Family, or God, family, church, and farm, and the country. That's a horrible thing that they did. Okay? Or I don't believe in God, but I love America, and I say that's a horrible thing they did. You see where relativism is breaking down, right? Not both parties can be right in their assessment of right and wrong. Somebody's got to be right and somebody's got to be wrong. It just doesn't work. So that's the problem with relativism. And the thing that the relativist doesn't see is they're making an absolute statement about relativism. There are absolutely no such thing as right and wrong. And that is absolutely right. Right? That's really what they're saying. So when you get into moral law, the question is who's right concerning morality and who's not. So C.S. Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, he was writing during, he did this. These were, first of all, radio addresses, in World War II, where Germany is bombing Britain. And what C.S. Lewis says is, he says, when people argue, they are appealing to a standard outside of themselves to arbitrate and have the final say. Right? 2 people get in an argument. Hey, what do you think? You're bringing in an outside standard of right and wrong. So C.S. Lewis says this. He says, first, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way, and they cannot get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not, in fact, behave in that way. They know the law of nature, and they break it. Or we can call this the law of morals. These 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe that we live in. So, in other words, going on with this argument, what Lewis would be saying is, we say that Britain's right, the Germans say that the Germans are right. But who's right? There has to be a transcendent ethical standard that determines what is right and wrong. It can't be what we think is right because you think we're wrong. It can't be what you think is right because we think you're wrong. Nor can it be a collaboration of what we together think is right because there might be other people who say that we're wrong. There has to be something completely outside of the human existence and experience that determines what morals are. Otherwise, it all breaks down. So another book by Lewis is called The Abolition of Man, where he gives some examples. You guys can read that on your own, okay? But so remember, we're talking here about natural revelation. We are using logic and reasoning to come to the idea of God. A couple more things about this, and then we'll take a break, okay? There's another thinker that I would highly recommend you to read, Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer essentially predicted postmodernism in his writings. And he has a book called He Is There and He Is Not Silent. And he puts some arguments for God he puts forward. And one of them is what he calls the metaphysical necessity, or the idea of being. And he quotes a non-Christian philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, and he says that the basic philosophic question is that something is there rather than that nothing is there. That is the basic philosophical question. Why is there something rather than nothing? And then he goes on to say, because man is finite, he is not a sufficient integration point for himself. And then he references Sartre again. No finite point has meaning unless it has an infinite reference point. With an impersonal beginning, he says, morals do not really exist as morals. If there's not a personal creator who has a sense of morality, humans who are persons don't have real morals. They are just community-shaped ideas. Everything is finally equal in morality then, because they don't come from something outside of us. There would be no standard in the universe which gives final meaning to such words as right and wrong. He wrote this in, I don't know if it was the 70s that this book was, or the 60s. He predicted postmodernism. Truth and morals must be absolute. If man in his present cruelty, apart from a fall from a better state, is what man has always been, and intrinsically is, how can there be any hope for a qualitative change? If man hasn't fallen and we recognize there's cruelty in the world, but this cruelty is essential to who we originally are, then there's no hope for it to change. Truth and morals must be absolute. So I'll just tell you in a very practical way, when I get into any of this with somebody, I can remember a Russian kid in Germany, and he was Russian, atheist, big surprise, right? And you understand why I'm saying that, right? Okay. Especially if you're in East Germany, totally different than West Germany because of communism. So I just talked about absolutes. And he's like, no, I don't believe there's any absolutes. So you walk him through all the scenarios. What if somebody kicked your sister, did this, he goes, well, I wouldn't like it, but I can't say it's wrong. I go, well, why wouldn't you like it? You shouldn't care at all, actually. Because there's no right and wrong. I mean, it breaks down on so many levels, right? That's why Peter Singer, who is a professor at Harvard, and he has a class he teaches on relativism, or not relativism, on ethics. And he's a relativist. You lose all footing. You lose all grounds to stand on if you're a relativist. Ultimately, truth and morality has to be absolute. And to me, that's the great argument with stuff like this, to say, who determined it? Because first of all, you show logically, there has to be an absolute. Sure, there are layers of the application of this absolute. That's ethics too. But there has to be a lawgiver of morality. And who is it? Is it Yahweh, or is it Allah, or is it Krishna? So these things point to God, but they do not define the biblical God sufficiently. We need the Bible for that. All right, I know it's really hot in here, so we'll take 10 minutes. Now, leaving all the difficult things, let's talk about evil and suffering. Get it? That's the difficult thing, evil, suffering. We'll just talk about it briefly, okay? The biggest issue that people have with the existence of God is the reality of evil and suffering. That was a mistake, by the way. Playing basketball right now. But the Bible does answer both, even if not to the degree that we want. But the question is, how can one define evil without any reference to God? Because we're saying evil's wrong, right? So we're getting into the area of absolutes. If we believe that there's an eternal evil and eternal good, well, what defines which one's good and evil? Because they would probably both say they're right. So suffering is another issue, and that is the result of evil in the world. Okay, several things about God. First of all, God claims to be good. Secondly, God claims to be all-powerful. And that the evil that exists is not sourced from him and is contrary to him. God claims to be good and all-powerful, and that evil is not from him. He's not the source, and it is contrary to him. Wow.
Is there any gas close by here?
Um,
Gas right down?
there is, but that would be so loud. Let's just suffer through it. Come on. It's like it's like having Bible college on a mission field.
Is there a fan in here?
I don't know. No. It's all right. I got out my preacher rag, you know. Oh, God's good. He's good. Okay, so here's the wrong conclusions we should draw from the fact that God is good and that he's all-powerful and that there's evil. The wrong option, and Grotius gives us these, is to say, first of all, that God does not exist. Then we don't have any way to describe evil. Another wrong view is what is called finite Godism, that God is finite and limited, and he's just unable. He's not all-powerful. He can't stop it. Thirdly, to say that God is not good. That's not an option. And fourthly, to say that evil is not real. So, what is evil? If we follow the Augustinian model, what we would say is evil is a privation of good. In other words, it is the loss or the absence of goodness. Okay? There's different types of evil. We have moral evil. We have what people have called, and we could debate whether or not we should call it this, natural evil, hurricanes and so on. So what is the biblical response? And this is all we have, okay? First of all, God created the world, and it was originally good. Then we have the fall. Through disobedience, man brought evil and its consequences into the world. Again, Grotius says, no other worldview explains our condition in light of a space-time defection from the original intention of the Creator. Okay. We're almost done with evil. By the way, it's a vast subject. You know, you can go read Aquinas and Origen and everybody else. So he has two little arguments here. First of all, God is omnipotent and omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing. God is omnibenevolent, all good. There is objective, real evil. So, for any evil that God allows, God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing this evil, even if we do not know what this morally sufficient reason is in some cases. His next argument, an omnipotent omniscient, omnibenevolent, right? All-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God made the world. He made a good world in which evil was possible and became actual by human sin and had a good reason for doing so. Therefore, the world contains evil. So God made the world with the potentiality of evil coming into it. And by man's choice, evil came into the world. You have like vibrate mode?
Yeah, I just did.
So Augustine has a thing, and he puts it like this. God is all powerful and God is all good. And evil's in the world. And he's omniscient, all wise, everything. So if an all powerful and all good God allows evil in the world, he has a good reason for it. And therefore, the existence of evil in the world on a higher plane can be a good thing. Now, we're not going to talk about how can perfect people fall, and free will. If God gave Adam and Eve free will and they sinned, and so what about Lucifer? How did he fall? We're not going to explore all that because that would just take forever. And honestly, we'd probably end up with just what we just stated. So, let's talk about the knowability of God. Okay, so God exists. We've talked about that, right? We've talked about arguments for it. Now we're saying not only does God exist, but he is also knowable. You can know him. So the question of God's existence isn't the only question that we need to deal with. We also ask whether or not knowledge of God is possible. Now, Norm Geisler tells us there are two basic kinds of agnostics, people who don't believe you can know. Those who say that the existence and nature of God are not known, and those who say that it is unknowable. So we'll focus on the second one, those who say that it's unknowable. Now, agnosticism means you can't know. So, meaning no, knowledge. The Greek negation, meaning not. So, no knowledge. Now, pertaining to theism, the belief that one cannot be sure as to the existence of God. That's what an agnostic is. Well, God might exist, but I don't know. And you don't know. Okay? That's agnosticism. You can't know for sure that God exists. Now, there's a strand of agnosticism called intellectual agnosticism. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip past David Hume and Immanuel Kant. But essentially, what they say is David Hume says that if you can't test it by quantity or number, he believed that knowledge comes through sensory experience, then you should commit it to the flames. So for Hume, all knowledge was received through the senses. And if God is immaterial, you can't know him by the senses, and thus you cannot know him. But that breaks down because abstract concepts such as love, kindness, and things like that, we would say those, somebody might say, no, that is material, it's just neurons in your brain. But it's not. So there's a lot of things that you can't just put in a test tube and test. Immanuel Kant says one cannot know reality. You can only know what your experience of something is. In other words, you can know what it is to you, but you don't know what something is in its essence, in and of itself. You know the appearance of the table, but you only know what it is as far as your experience with it. All right. So the problem with agnosticism, these statements make claims that they say are impossible. It's self-defeating. If you say one cannot know anything about God, why is that self-defeating?
How do you know because he's not existing? Because we know not existing things that can't know.
You're claiming to know something about God that he can't be known. How do you know that if you can't know anything about God? Kant, concerning reality, says that you can't know what the reality of something is, only your experience of it. But yet you're making a statement about the reality of that thing by saying that it's unknowable. So you know enough about it to say you can't know it. Ultimately, to make any statement that says you can't know something about God is self-defeating. Okay? There's an illustration that sometimes you'll hear. There's an elephant, and religions are all like men that have blindfolds on. And, you know, the elephant is God, and so there's, hey, what's God like? Oh, and he fills the lake. Man, God is, you know, round. He's, you know, got some scabs here, all that. Another man has the trunk. No, actually God is, you know, and he starts describing the trunk. And they say, we all have a different hold on God. And so thus we're all describing him differently. Okay? What's the problem with that? Okay.
What's the problem with that? With that?
Why is that wrong? Why does that not work? To say that all religions are equally valid.
Because all religions contradict. Most religions contradict.
But no, it's just one has the leg, the other has a tail, the other has the ears.
But they're only getting one part.
The trunk is not the elephant, or the tail is not the elephant. It's, you know, beyond.
Okay. Can give it a shot?
Each religion attempts to make, or attempts to tell people how they should live on earth. And in that sense, there's because they'll contradict, that's where it can contradict. They're not talking about different sections of it. They're talking about, it's just talking about
What it is.
present living on like how we should live. They're talking about the same thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm shooting for. So to the pluralist who says, no, you have your description of God and I have mine, he's like this big elephant. And, you know, you're describing him as a trunk, I'm describing him as a foot. What do you say? What's wrong with that? What does that statement presuppose? That we know what an elephant is and we're able to say that's what's going on.
Don't know.
Somebody's already said, no, that's an elephant. And you just have the leg and you just have the... In order to make that statement, somebody has to have a full picture of an elephant. Right? Otherwise, you can't. I don't know it's a leg to an elephant or a trunk to an elephant. And so you're saying that we're all doing that. You're saying that you know the whole picture about God. And the problem is, your whole picture about God is so contradictory to mine in terms that cannot be reconciled. So, but then it could go, well, a leg is quite different than a trunk. But so the idea is it presupposes that somebody knows what an elephant is, the form and the shape, and can say that's what's going on. All right, moving on. All that to say, God is knowable, right? But what we're saying is not that God is knowable completely. There is the idea of God's incomprehensibility. Paul said that, right, in Romans 11. There's a lot that we don't know about God. We can't comprehend his greatness. His greatness, Psalm 144 and 45, we read this morning, is unsearchable. So what we're saying is not that we can have an exhaustive knowledge about God, but sufficient knowledge. Part of our knowledge of God is knowing that he is beyond complete comprehension, but that what he has revealed is enough, and it cannot be contradicted by the things he has not revealed. So,
on that statement there, I just think it's an important thing to recognize that is a finite state, but also in man's fallen state, because Adam was different at the time, meaning our comprehension, Adam's comprehension at the time before his fall was much greater as a man than it is for us now as a fallen man.
So there's two things working against us in that, yeah. But that's what we admit. We don't know everything. We don't know God exhaustively, but sufficiently. And so it's okay to say, yes, there are certain things about God that you don't know. So the Bible affirms that we can know God. I don't want to make light of using Bible verses, but I'm just going to say them because of time and let you write them down, okay? Matthew 11:27, 1 John 1 through 4. In the beginning was the Word was with God. Or no, wait, that's that which was from the beginning, which we have seen and heard. Our fellowship is with him. John 10:27, Jesus says he knows his sheep. They know him. Philippians 3:10, that I may know him. Matthew 7:21 through 23, Jesus says, depart from me, I never knew you, implying that there's people that he does know. 7:21 through 23. Okay. Now moving on. The next thing to talk about is the language that we use to describe God. Remember, God revealed himself to humans in human words, and he uses human ideas and concepts to convey who he is and what he is like. So we have to be careful as we interpret statements. Like, so today in staff meeting, people are like, does God have a face? You know, may his face shine upon you. Does God have a face? Then what does that mean? Okay. So when we talk about God's eyes and his nose and things like that, we can't take these very, very literally, right? But what are they trying to convey? So you have metaphors or symbolic language. So for instance, in Psalm 91 verse 4, God has feathers. So in our worship service, should we be looking for angel feathers flying around? No. So, but God is referred to as having feathers. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 13, as having eyes, the eyes of the Lord. In John chapter 10 verse 7, he is the door. Does that mean he's a literal wooden door with a doorknob? Knock, knock. Who's there? Me, Jesus. Wow, a talking door. He's a shield, Genesis 15:1. These are metaphors. They convey something. He's a shield. He protects. He's a rock. He's stable. He's the door. He's the entrance. He has eyes. He has knowledge. Okay? Also, what are called anthropomorphisms, which speak of God with human features, like a face. Or in Deuteronomy 33:27, God having arms, or a back in Jeremiah 18:17. God is without form. He's immaterial. These are morphe meaning form, anthro meaning man, speaking of God in the form of man. Okay? The Bible's full of this type of language. If you've taken hermeneutics, you know it, right? But what these things do is they apply material items to God for an analogy, who is immaterial. So even though they can't be taken literally, they do point to a literal truth. So his eyes refer to the fact that he knows, that he sees, that he's cognizant of what is going on in his world. The shield, again, for protection. He protects people. So in theology, just beware of the language of God, of God's descriptions. Okay. Now let's get into the attributes of God. All that to get to describing him more. There's various ways that people classify the attributes of God. And again, for the sake of time, I'll just tell you what we're going to do. So, we're going to follow the idea that God has incommunicable and communicable attributes. So incommunicable ones would be things that he does not share in common with us. Can somebody think of one? Okay, right. So omniscience. Basically all the omnis. Omnibenevolent, right? Communicable would be things that have a partial counterpart. So even omniscience, there's a partial counterpart because we have wisdom, we have knowledge. But like eternality, you know, infinity, communicable, love, right? Compassion. So today we're going to try and get as far as we can talking about the incommunicable attributes. Now, when we talk about his attributes, too, I'll just skip right past that.
Just like, I don't know if you're going to get to it, but how is eternality communicable if we're all going to have that eternal soul?
Well, but do we have a beginning?
Oh,
Yeah. It's a good question, though. Okay, so let's jump right into them. See how far. Oh, no. We don't have a lot of time if we're going to do our project. So let's get going. First of all, the solitariness of God. The solitariness of God. By this we mean his self-sufficiency, independence, and lack of lack. When God created the world, we've already talked about this, he didn't do it because he needed anything, but rather it was the free act of his will to demonstrate his glory. The nature of the Trinity meets all the needs that any being could have. Fellowship, love. A.W. Pink says, during a past eternity, God was alone, self-contained, and self-sufficient. self-satisfied, and in need of nothing. So nothing adds to him. Worship doesn't add. Worship is a response. It doesn't add to his worth, just our sense of it. Also, this means God is under no obligation to anything at any time. He is independent and uncaused. You could write down Acts 17, verse 24 and 25, Psalm 50, verse 1 and 2. Okay. Secondly, God's eternality. God, who is self-existent, dwells from eternity. No beginning and no end. We've talked about that enough, I think, in this class so far. So, you ready for some verses to write down? Revelation chapter 1, verse 8. Psalm 90, verse 2, talking about God's eternality. Exodus 3:14. John chapter 1, verse 3. And I'll just give you one more. 1 Timothy 1:17. So God is unaffected by time, and in his person, he is unbound by it. He knows all things simultaneously. He's never learning, he's never growing, and he's never surprised. God lives in a constant present with movement within the Godhead, even in his relation to time-space events. He transcends it, and he is above and beyond it. So God sees all time perfectly. It's mysterious when you try to think about God's relationship to time, because God, you could say, lives in an ever-present now. You know, Karl Barth, I was reading, says he lives in eternal time. It's trippy to think about, you know, and I'm not even going to pretend like I can completely comprehend it and explain it. But what we emphasize is that even though God has a relationship to time, he's not affected by it or limited by it, nor has he entered into such a relationship that he's added to by it. And God is fully cognizant of all things that will ever happen at all times, at all moments of his life. If we can say he has moments even, right? Because he's eternal. Now, it doesn't mean he's static and that he doesn't move and that he's still. He's dynamic, because the tri-personality within the Godhead means that there's a reciprocation of love and communication and fellowship. And God, in his eternality and omniscience, he sees everything at once. He sees a succession of events at once. You know what I'm saying? It is a supra sort of knowledge. You know, like somebody goes, well, you mean he's seen the flood just happening? Well, he's seen everything happening. I don't even know how we should describe it. It's just he's fully cognizant of all things that happen in time and space. And we could say that things that are yet future to us, he's fully aware of. And he's seen them as if they've happened, because to him they have, because he knows. Is that okay? So his relationship as an eternal being to time, our problem is we try to reflect on eternality as time-oriented people. And so we bring time-oriented concepts and apply them. So God's thoughts. Does God think, okay, this is a good thing, that's a bad... Like, I just don't see God like that. I think his knowledge is so perfect. And his ability and his plan that, you know, we could picture him weighing the options, sure, but I don't think he needs to logically come to a good conclusion as to what to do. He just knows what to do. And he knows what to do because he knows what to do, and that's the thing to do. And so that's the thing he does. You know? He doesn't make mistakes. I mean, we're getting more into the area of omniscience here, but because what we're trying to say is how does that relate to time and to creatures in time and to how he sees the events of time. He's just fully aware. Okay? So here's a question. Will there be time in heaven? There'll be no sun, no moon. It'll always be light. But yet there will be movement. It's a good question. Like, I'll be honest, I don't know. And, you know, with certain things, I have no problem saying I don't care. It's not that I don't care about heaven, but, yeah. You know, some guys, they just want to be able to totally explain everything. Well, we'll be there, so there'll be an element to creaturely, finite experiences. But I don't know, how different is it going to be in a resurrected state, though?
At what time again?
Nap time. That's my heaven.
So,
Right.
I don't know if this is going off topic, and like don't do this. So like the people who go, like they're dying now, they go to heaven, are they still bound in time to them? Like if they die,
Right.
is the
Spirits,
situation
yeah.
there?
Spiritually, I would say no. I mean, they're having an experience in heaven in God's habitation,
Yeah.
and they're with Him. So, but still, they don't experience things the same way God does.
Yeah.
I mean-
Like that's my question. Well, I don't know if it's like if it makes sense with the question. So like if
They're subject to time in the sense that they still have to be reunited with their body. But at their present experience, you know, their spirit is outside of the material realm. So their experience is a purely spiritual one right now.
Might be both.
No, because they're separated from their bodies. It's not material.
Oh, okay, I was talking in relation to time, yeah.
Yeah, it's, yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. It's just an interesting thing. It seems that because we're finite creatures, we're going to somehow experience events in succession. But will that experience be something that we would consider in the time temporal ordering of things? I don't know. So, eternality for us in heaven may refer more to duration than actual essence. Right? Because even within the Godhead, it's a trippy thing. There is movement. You know, God's not static. I mean, it's just gnarly to think about. But he's not just there and doesn't move or whatever. God is dynamic. He is able within the members of the Godhead to experience love and fellowship and communication. And that implies some sort of movement. So there's movement within the Godhead. But then again, we're getting into areas that we don't know all the answers to, right? So God, eternality. Next, His infinitude. You know, like the infinity pools, it's supposed to look like it just keeps going and going and going. Or if you have an Infinity, the car, because you'll be taking it to the mechanic for infinity. So when we speak of God's infinitude, we say He is without limits. 2 Chronicles 2:6. I'm going to try to turn it real quick. Okay, I'm there. Solomon with the temple, right? But who is able to build him a temple, since heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain him? The heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain God. He exists infinitely. Because God is spirit and self-existent, all of His nature and all of His attributes He has infinitely. So, His power, He never runs out. Right? He's like Tefera, when Tefera's working out, just infinite power. Okay? His love is infinite. There's no end to it. There's no boundary. There's no limit. So again, God has a mysterious relationship to time and space. His eternality, spirituality, and infinitude does not mean, though, that he cannot involve himself in time, but rather that he enters it as an unrestrained actor. Nextly, spirit, spirituality. God is spirit. That is his essence. He is a spiritual being. So, remember what Jesus said in John 4:24 to the Samaritan woman? What? I didn't hear what you said. That's to Philip in John 14.
The true worshipers who worship in spirit and truth.
Why?
Because God is spirit.
Right. God is spirit. That's his essence. So there's the two words, the Hebrew word ruah, which means breath or wind or spirit. Don Bloch says this. He says, the God of the Bible is not a material being, nor is he a composite, put together being. He is invisible and spiritual, not visible and physical. We're talking about his essence. The Greek word pneuma, you guys need me to spell that for you? The idea behind that, and that's the word that we have in John chapter 4, verse 24, is that transcendental, immaterial essence of entities such as God. John uses it in this sense when he says, Jesus says God is spirit. He is not a material being. He uses such as life and wind and breath are relevant, but in terms of God's nature, the immaterial focus of his essence is in view. He is immaterial. Thus, he can be omnipresent, right? Because he's immaterial. Now, notice what Donald Bloch said. He said he's not material, nor is he composite. When we say he's not composite, we mean he's not made up of parts. This is called the simplicity of God. He is simple, meaning there's no parts. John chapter 1, verse 18. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. He's spirit, invisible. 1 Timothy 1:17, we've already read this, to the King of the ages, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. He's invisible because he's spirit. Okay, life. Next thing about God is life. And just quickly, this comes with the aseity of God. He has life in himself. He is life. He didn't get it anywhere. And his life is qualitatively different than ours. John chapter 5, verse 26, for as the Father has life in himself, so he granted the Son too as well. John chapter 1, verse 4, in him was life. Personality. We're charging through these things. I've got about 12 of them. In contrast with an Eastern idea that God is some impersonal mind or force, the Bible affirms that God is personal. He has a mind and a will, a purpose, relational capacity, and intention. Next, sovereignty, meaning God is the ruler. He is free in all his actions and in control of all things at all times. He works out his plan with wisdom and effectiveness. Do you guys think that's right? Is God in control of all things at all times?
You said work with wisdom and
What?
you said you work with wisdom.
Effectiveness. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11, Paul says, God works all things after the counsel of his will. Pretty heavy statement if you think about it. Especially when we want to think about the fall. What's going on there? So, whatever happens in God's world is under his supervision and guidance as he brings his plans to pass. There's no accidents, surprises, or mistakes in God's economy. So God is in complete control of all things at all times, and he has a plan and a purpose in everything. From this doctrine, we get the idea of God's decrees, meaning his eternal plan, what he wants to do, and God's providence, how he brings that to pass. We'll talk about providence more when we talk about creation. But essentially, it's how God orders the affairs of the world. He is providing. So a few verses here. Daniel chapter 4, verse 35. Speaking of God, he does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain him, his hand, or say to him, what have you done? Daniel chapter 4, verse 35. That's Nebuchadnezzar's words, so you might want to debate that. John chapter 19, verse 11. Jesus saying to Pilate, you could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Job 42 in verse 3. Verse 2. I know that you can do everything and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. I love that so much, I'll just take it right out here. The Bible's falling apart. Okay, so God is sovereign. Also, God is omnipotent. The Bible presents God as having all power. If he's infinite, then his power is infinite. He's able to accomplish what he sets out to do. The word for almighty in Greek, pantokrator, has the idea that God possesses all power and authority. So Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, what does it say? God is able to do exceedingly, abundantly, right. Luke chapter 1, verse 37, with God, nothing will be impossible. He is El Shaddai. He is the Almighty One. God is also omniscient. God has complete knowledge, this is the next one, omniscience, of all things at all times. He doesn't learn and he doesn't grow. To learn would mean you're not perfect. It would imply you were added to. But a perfect being cannot be added to. So, think about Psalm 139, verse 4. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely. You discern my thoughts from afar. Psalm 147, verse 5. His understanding is infinite. Okay. Now, with the omniscience of God, another thing to discuss is, and this is the issue, lately, the doctrine of the openness of God. Have you guys heard of that? Open theism? No? Okay. So there are some verses that suggest that God changes his mind based on what he's learned. And though we might refer to these as anthropopathisms, having God with human emotions, that's one of the reasons. Okay, so here's the question. If my actions are really free, then God doesn't know them. I mean, if I really have free will, libertarian free will, God doesn't know what I'm going to do. It's really kind of the premise there. It's a vast subject to consider, and the implications are also huge. So if you believe in the openness of God, which is called open theism, what you're saying is that God is not omniscient. He doesn't know the future. And ultimately, I think you'd have to say he's not omnipotent. I mean, or at least he's limited himself. I don't know. But so if God doesn't know what's going to happen, that's what open theism teaches. How does he predict it? Because open theism says God learns by what we do. So God gets pretty lucky a lot of times, I think. I mean, they use a lot of verses, but we're just kind of familiarizing ourselves with the concept. Also, if free will means that God cannot know what I'm going to do, then God doesn't know everything. Or if free will means that God cannot sovereignly determine what humans will do without violating their free choice, then how can he accomplish his plans? Here's where your buzzwords Calvinism and Arminianism are coming into play. That's the debate. The nature of what free will is and the nature of what God's sovereignty is. And if man is really free, libertarian free will, self-caused, that's it, by me, generated by me, they say, then God doesn't know what I'm going to do. Because if he does know, then it's not free because he already knows. Now, this is an extreme form of Arminianism, and not all Arminians, hold to this view. Or at least, I won't even, people at least with this view of God's knowledge. If somebody said, don't call me an Arminian, whatever. But so that's the question, right? If this is true, that God's knowledge is open, he's learning as he goes, and that's because we're free. He doesn't know the future, and he can't really control things. So all those prophecies that he made, he got lucky because he didn't know, right? And he got also very lucky because or you could say he got lucky because he couldn't control anything, but yet it happened. Again, vast subject we're starting to touch here. Okay. So Bruce Ware, who, just for so that you guys know, he's dialoguing, and he comes from a Reformed position. And he has a book called God's Lesser Glory, and it's a good book. And he says this about open theism. Philosophically, open theists argue that true human freedom is possible only if the future is open. If God knows all that will occur in the future, then we're not free to do differently than what God knows, and hence we are not truly free. Right? That's what they say. Furthermore, since God can only know what is real, he cannot by definition know the future because it has not yet happened, and so it's not real. Again, all this based on a very strict view of what free will is. A very limited and strict view. Bruce Ware would go on to say that this actually is the logical progression of Arminianism, but whilst others would say the logical progression of Calvinism is a very hyper-determinism. But there's a lot we could talk about here. There's also the question then of compatibilism, which would say this: God can determine actions that are done freely without violating human responsibility. Okay. If open theism is correct, we must acknowledge that the openness of God, when compared to the orthodox view of God, is very different. It follows that his wisdom and providential control, right, working things, are greatly affected. God not only learns what happens moment by moment, as do we, but he also realizes moment by moment which of his beliefs about the future have been wrong. Yes, the God of open theism is mistaken about much. All right. That's just something, you know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's out there, okay? You can read. Find journal articles. Next, we have God's He's like, throw all this on you and say, moving on, huh? Omnipresence. God is everywhere. Psalm 139, verse 7 through 10, where can I go from your spirit? Now, we have to keep God's omnipresence balanced with his holiness, that he is separate from the world, even though he's everywhere. Right? God is everywhere. So this is God. Is God, you know, in this wall? Is this wall God? God is everywhere, but not everything. Okay, that's pantheism, saying God is everything. Okay. Immutability. Now, the question is, does God change? Again, another very complicated and discussed thing. And it ties into open theism. Because they would say, well, God changed what he's going to do. Obviously, he's changing as he goes. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's making moment-by-moment decisions. So immutability says God does not change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. His activities may change, but his attributes do not. And there's a difference. God could change his course of action, but he doesn't change his nature. And how he expresses his attributes, he'll remain the same in having his attributes, but yet he might exercise them differently at different times.
What exactly, like I kind of get what you mean, but I guess more defined on how you say his actions.
What he's doing, like, so for instance, he tells Jonah, tell them to repent in Nineveh. I'm going to go, and Jonah goes in, or he says, go there, and Jonah says, in 40 days Nineveh will be overthrown or whatever. And then they repent, and then so God doesn't do it. Now, God changed on a small level what he was going to do based on their response. But it didn't affect his nature. His person doesn't change, you see? So some say God does change. For instance, God in Genesis chapter 6, he regretted, he's like, man, I wish I hadn't made man and all that. But we should probably call that an anthropopathism. But these are challenging verses for us to deal with. So verses about God's immutability. Malachi 3:6. The Lord your God does not change. James chapter 1, verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. So, does God change his mind? Think of Moses interceding in Exodus 32 and what God says he's going to do. And Moses intervenes. And God relents. Did God change his mind?
Would that scenario kind of fall in the same place as the people of Abraham when we saw it like a test?
Could be, yeah. God's, heart for Israel wasn't to do that, to punish them. And Moses reminds him of everything he did, so it could have been to build that in Moses. But yet, when we look at stuff like that, we should take it very serious, that God heard Moses' prayer. God responds to situations as they are in the moment. For us, at least. That's how we can view it. But again, his nature doesn't change. And even sometimes, I don't even know if we should say he changed his mind, just his course of actions as the situation changes. It's mysterious. So, with all that, we would say, is God impassible? Can he be acted on? Greek philosophical concepts of a static God who didn't move influence the idea that God doesn't feel or anything like that. Because that would mean he changed. But what we would say is this. To feel something that is consistent with your attributes isn't to change. You don't get a new attribute. And whenever God responds, he responds under control. But still some would say, well, if God can be acted on and affected by things, then he is changeable. But we'd say not in his essence. And he always responds under control. Now what about prayer? This is an interesting thing. How does prayer work? Does it change God or what he's going to do? I mean, he tells us pray and believe that I will use that prayer and I'll hear it and I'll change things. So it doesn't change him, but God uses prayer to change things. Prayer, well, see, that's the thing about prayer, is it's mysterious that, God knows what needs to be done and all that, and in one sense, he doesn't need prayer. But prayer invites human participation and an expression of human dependence. And prayer are one of the tools that God would use to accomplish things. God uses our prayers. Okay? But as far as we know, he says we have to take it serious. You have not because you ask not. And so we wouldn't say prayer has changed him. All it's done is taken full advantage of the access that he's given us to things. Still. See, the attributes and prayer and eternal God, time-based creatures, God not being able to change, prayer affecting what he's going to do in the world from our perspective. You see? And there's a lot of prayers in the Bible that it looks like without them, God wouldn't have done something. Or at least they wouldn't have answered them in a certain way.
Do you think that prayer move God is to do things or is to
Well, some people don't like the idea of the Augustinian model that prayer, you hear people say prayer doesn't change things, it changes us. Right? Some people go, no, prayer does change things. Well, yeah, it does. God uses it to change things. But we have to pray submitted to God in his will. You know what I'm saying? And what prayer does is it more and more, it's part of us submitting to get in line with God's will and asking him for things and letting him respond the way he's going to respond. And when he answers it, we could say, okay,
so
he planned to use that prayer.
on asking and not asking, is there any impact on things to be done or to be happened?
Yeah, on the human level, yeah. I mean, on the eternal level, with what God's going to do, I don't know. That's what's mysterious about it. And I think that if God gave us all the answers in prayer, it'd probably be very unhealthy for us. Because we need the mystery of prayer. But we should take prayer serious, that if I haven't prayed for that, then why would I expect it's going to happen? Like, I should take my prayer serious, that when I pray for things, that without me praying, it won't happen. And it still could not, let's be honest, but we should take prayer serious, that God will answer it.
If prayer changes people, then like Jesus prayed. So I don't think the purpose of prayer is to change people, because I don't know that Jesus and his character changed when he prayed.
Jesus is a very unique person too, though. Right? I mean, he had unbroken fellowship with the Father. There's times where, like, he's praying all night, then he picks his apostles the next day. It would seem maybe he was, as a human, aligning himself with what God, seeking the Father about the right decisions.
So it's kind of just like the more often we pray and we study, our prayers will end up aligning with God's will. And because it's aligning with his will, they're going to come through.
It's like, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart, right? If you're delighting in God, you're going to start to get his desires birthed in you. And your desires will be aligned with his because he's putting them in you. Yeah.
That break out of that, like yourself, means making your extreme hot.
And Jesus said, if my words abide in you, you'll ask, whatever in my name, and I'll give it to you. That's why it's important to me to pray the word of God, like this morning, to begin praying with the ideas of Scripture. So, yeah, it's trippy. I mean, again, a lot of dense subjects, right? So I would say prayer doesn't change God, but it might be used by God to change his course of action. And we should believe that. Hold on.
Would you think that God, in that situation with Moses, that it reveals, that Moses' response reveals the heart of God? Being inspired by God, knowing what his reaction was going to be.
Well, yeah, but the thing, I believe very strongly in the sovereignty of God and what he's doing in the world, but I just don't want to take away from the reality of what, for Moses at that moment, to him, if I don't do this, God's seriously going to do this. And I don't have a neat answer to it, because I would still say God doesn't change.
That Moses' response reveals the heart of God.
Yeah.
In that, role reversal, that interaction with the two, what was coming out there
Right.
is what, God's heart with
Yeah.
his people.
And even if we do say that, God responded to Moses' prayer and changed what he's going to do. The Bible is so rich with the mystery of God's relationship to man, that we also have other stuff that God does. Nobody's asked him, and nobody's even asked, and God hasn't asked anybody's opinion, and he does it, and he uses people. Cyrus, Judas, you know, stuff where we go, okay, God actually says, I did that. You know what I'm saying? So prayer must be according to God's will. And prayer is very mysterious, and we should take it serious. Okay, so here's the conclusion of that. God does not change in his nature or his attributes, but he does change his dealings with man. It doesn't mean he's changed. God is able to change what he's doing in the world at a different time and still be consistent with who he is. Okay? All right. So you'll take your break, and then you'll have a class project that will be this. If you want, write it down as I say it. Like I said, I'm sorry I don't have it written down for you. Why don't you talk about the problem of evil? First of all, how can a good God allow evil? Or did he? Maybe he had no control over that. Can it be said, does God have a purpose for evil? When evil happens, does God have a purpose in it? Can we say that? If evil is contrary to God? If so, if God, right, I'll put a question mark, if so, if he's using evil, if God uses evil, then how can evil actions be held accountable? You understand what I'm asking there? You can consider these verses, Genesis 15, or Genesis 50, verse 20, and Acts 4, 23 and 4. Shoot, that's 2. Acts 2, 23 and 4, and 4, 27 and 8. You understand? So, okay, how can a good God allow evil? Or maybe he didn't, because he had no control. If he did, is there a purpose for evil? Can we say that God has a purpose in it? Evil being contrary to God, can God have a purpose for it if it's contrary to him? If God is using evil, if he has a purpose for it, then how can he hold the people who commit evil actions accountable for what they've done? Because that's their free will, but he is using it. How does that work? If he's really in control, how can their free will be under his control and he uses their evil things to accomplish his purposes? And you can look at those verses. Okay?
We kind of agree that yes, he did, because evil exists, and he did not, and he is omnipotent. So if he could stop it, he would have stopped it, but he didn't. So he did allow evil. And how he could, you raised the point that it came through Satan, that he allowed Satan to be prideful, and then allowed sin to enter the world that way.
Right, through the fall.
That's
On down through
Okay, so he allowed it.
Right.
Okay, does he have a purpose for it?
Oh, yeah.
Guys, no,
Yeah,
come on,
he-
go for it.
Yeah, well, I know. Yeah, he does have a purpose for evil. I mean, ultimately, it is just to show his glory. I mean, we were talking about it as colleagues that although, yeah, there's evil, he allows that, but it also shows that Satan's evil plan
So he allowed it with a purpose, or he got the purpose after he allowed it? Because if he has a purpose, then that means maybe, was it part of his plan?
I would say instead of allowing, but it came because of free will. God doesn't violate anyone's free will. So even us had his own free will. So that's why God let him do what he wants, because God doesn't violate anyone's free will.
So then God didn't really necessarily allow it then. He's like,
not purposely allowing.
like he's like, oh well, I don't want this to happen, but it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then why did he even make man in the first place then? Could have just avoided it.
Well, he allowed the evil, and going back, like you were saying, he created the possibility for it. But then we tied that also to what we were talking about in eschatology, like two weeks ago. That if his whole purpose, for creating the world was just for the garden for evil,
Garden for evil.
If the purpose solely was us being in the Garden of Eden forever, just in that state, then God failed his plan. But then the question was that really his plan? So his ultimate plan was for redeemed man.
Okay, but then that means that had to include evil and sin to be redeemed from. So that means evil's part of his plan.
Yeah, he's using it.
But is it part of his plan? Because you were saying his plan was to have redeemed humanity.
Yeah.
So then he planned that evil would be coming.
Yeah, he knew it.
He planned it, or he knew it? Or he knew it, so he planned it?
To say that's yes, the answer is yes. According to, if we're going to go with
Well, I'm
the eschatology class.
Okay, so then God doesn't have a plan for it.
For it.
Evil.
God doesn't have a plan for it, but his purpose in the plan originated from what evil did.
Oh, so when evil came, he devised a plan?
No, he had the plan before, so yes, I guess he does.
Yeah.
Yeah, going back to
He
that.
planned for evil to come into the world so that he could redeem them. And going back to eschatology, teaching is redeemed man is better than innocent.
So God planned for evil to be in the world.
Yeah.
Kind of knew
Yeah,
that evil would be in the world.
Well,
It was
so-
foreknowledge.
So he
Therefore,
planned.
it was
And so
his plan.
according to his
Oh.
master plan,
So he knew it, and then so therefore he planned accordingly?
Well, so here's the question I want to raise up, because
I'm thinking
because here's the
like
here's
that.
the
It's just
here's the
like it
thing.
sounds.
So
think of Genesis 50.
it's so it's easy to say like, oh, God knew what the decisions man would make, but bottom line, in my opinion, anyways, when God had the decision to make a person, to create a person, he would have known whether they would have all of their decisions, and at that moment he could have chosen whether to create them or not. And if it was bad, he could have chosen not to create them. And so in that sense, the scary thing is, if we're saying like God planned for evil to enter the world so that he could redeem man, and so that he could show the world, and as we were talking about in eschatology, the heavenly realm, the manifold wisdom of God, showing him the grace and the justice, like we were talking with David Lee before. It shows a new part of himself. But the problem with that is that if you accept that, then you know that when God had the decision to create people he knew would reject him and end up going to hell, he still chose to create them anyways. And in that sense, he believed, or he determined that man's suffering is worth that. So it's just that's what, if you're gonna say like redeemed man is better than innocent man, you have to also accept that. And that's why I'm a little bit like, I know that like I'm just a little bit like I'm not absolutely willing to accept it yet, even though that does sound great, but it's just like I'm just kind of caught on the fence right now.
I think one thing, yeah.
Right, well, so
What about Elijah?
On God's attribute, just we learned, this today. God's nature doesn't change, but his action changes, right? based on what's going on or happened. That because of human being way or evil way or whatever happened, God actually changed it, but not his original nature or his attribute that he changed. So based on this fact, God created, even first of all, Satan, he was not evil, right? He was just the angel.
Worship leader.
Yeah, and it's a
Most worship
leader
leaders are
in
evil,
the
if you ask me.
hierarchy
No, just
of the
kidding.
angels. So, because of his evil doing, just God actually changed it for him and for
Okay.
human being. That I think that's my.
So then, does God have a purpose for evil? If anybody says eschatology class once more, I'm going to. Eliza, does God have a purpose for evil? Oh, Romans 8:28. Wow. So God has a purpose for those things, and He's working them for good.
Well, so it's like this.
So He has a purpose in
So
them.
I'm gonna make fun of Microsoft on behalf of you, so you don't have to.
I don't have anything. I use Microsoft Word.
Okay, let's say,
I'm,
let's say my phone, for example. My phone is terrible. Now, I might not like that phone.
he's from Seattle.
I am.
They need to know.
My phone, I don't
So he's really sad because we all saw that interception at the 2-yard line. Okay.
We're not going to talk about that.
God's using that evil for good, right? Okay.
So I don't like my phone. It's slow. It's not very. It's kind of big. It's not.
It's Microsoft.
Okay, sure, whatever. Now, just because I don't like it, but it's all I have, I can still use it for good. That doesn't necessarily mean that like this is the best phone that I chose. Like the best phone. Like if I had the option to choose.
It's like an iPhone.
Right. Whatever.
But you're using it.
But I'm using it for good. So it's like God.
So you have a purpose for it. You use it purposefully.
Right. But it's not. That doesn't guarantee that this is the best possible version of what I want. But just like.
But you use it purposefully.
Yes.
Like you could get another phone. You could throw it away.
You could get an iPhone.
Throwing money aside, yes.
Yeah, you could say, this phone is bad. I'm going to get a better one.
Yes.
But I'm using this, like intentionally. I purposefully use it. I don't just say, phone's doing what it's doing. I
Yes.
input and I use it.
Right.
Okay.
But I'm not determining this phone to be the best phone.
No, but you're using
Right.
it.
I am using it.
And you're determining to use it.
And I'm determining to use it. Yes.
Okay, so does God purpose evil? Does God have a purpose for evil? Does God use evil with a determinate purpose? Because according to your phone illustration, I would have to say He does. So God does use evil.
Right. He does use.
He uses evil, but He doesn't have a purpose for it, Tavares?
No, okay.
No, he does use evil. Like.
Purposefully.
Just,
Yeah.
like.
Okay.
He will use evil.
Did God have a purpose in allowing evil?
Yes, and at the very so the basic answer that everyone gives is because of free will, and so the purpose of in that case the purpose of evil is to allow for free will, and then
That's a really great
in
thing.
a separate class we will take
Just so that free will can exist, I'm going to let evil come into the world.
well,
I'm
it's
for- I'm for
because
that's
if
fine.
because so if he knows, like according to that argument, if God allows free will, he knows that the cost of that is the potential for evil to enter the world.
Okay.
And so in that sense, and then because of that, because he wants to honor free will, evil enters the world, and that's what he has, and he's determining to use that evil because it's better than to take away the free will of man. If that makes sense.
So He's using evil, but He's not taking away from the free will of man. But in using evil, He's violating all sorts of free will, it seems like.
How's he violating free will?
Well, I don't know if He's using evil, if He's using evil actions and stuff. Like how does that work? Because He has a plan, if He has a plan. I don't know. You said He does. You said He doesn't. Tefera is kind of in between.
Plan.
Tefera wants him to have a plan, but he doesn't like the plan.
I think God has a plan.
Genesis 50:20.
So what about this whole, like, okay, back to your thing, Jesus is the lamb slain from what? Foundation of the world. Okay, so then did God, before he made the world, have a plan to...
Yeah, I mean, from before he created the foundation of the
But
earth,
so then-
verse, it's like it was already said that he was going to have to come down and die for our sin.
But that's because God knew man would fall.
Yeah.
So Jesus being the lamb slain from the foundation of the world was plan B or something?
No, that was his plan
But why would he need to come and die if plan A was that sin wouldn't be in the world?
A, because that wasn't plan
But that's what Tefera said.
A. But what I was saying before in the other class, you know, if plan A was supposed to, was actually plan A, then it failed miserably. But we know that as far as God being omniscient and omnipotent, plan A couldn't fail because that means that he's fallible. So
Okay.
for plan B, which was for him to come and die to be legit, to be his actual plan, then evil did need to come into the world in order for that to even make sense, for him having to come and die. So in the sense, yes, he does have his purpose for evil. His purpose for evil is to bring about his actual plan, plan A, which was actually for
I have
him
a
to come
question.
and to die.
So can we say that God orchestrated, if he had a plan for evil to do these things, so if the planner is, can we say for the evil doing, the planner is God?
Did God plan that evil would happen, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, I would have.
What did Elijah say? What? His purposes. Let's say his eternal purposes that he's carrying out in the world. Does he have eternal purposes? Right? I mean, Ephesians 1:11, he works all things after the counsel of his will. So, I mean, that doesn't mean he wanted to fall, but it just means he worked all things after the counsel of it or whatever. But, I mean, how can God have a purpose for evil and yet it not be his original intention? Is that possible?
I think
I mean, I'm just wondering.
I'm not able to reconcile that fact. I think the way how I see it, he had to allow evil, and he had to have a purpose for evil, and the purpose might be that to show the redemption story, I guess. Like it might be to show that redeemed man is better than innocent man. But God must have had a purpose. God must have purposed evil because he's omniscient and he knew ahead of time that evil would enter the world, and I don't see how that could be a plan B.
So he purposed it because he knew it would come. So that's not really
That's how we can figure it.
that's not really purposing though then, is it? I mean,
Well, yes, but at the same time, like he purposed. So before the foundation of the world, God is thinking that He's going to show something to the heavenly realm based on Ephesians 3:8, and
which is
that before the foundation of the world, God is using the church to demonstrate the manifold wisdom of God in the heavenly realm. So
that's from the eschatology class, right?
it may or may not be.
It
I
is.
think it's primarily in the Bible.
I know. No, I know Dave loves to
That's
talk
right,
about that.
It is from the eschatology.
Yeah, I know.
Or Job.
Wow.
The book of Job teaches you.
Okay, what about, so we've come to some sort of agreement that we have to think that God has some purpose with evil. The whole nature of the ins and outs, plan A, plan B, right? Okay, so does God use evil then? Okay, so if he uses evil, and that includes evil actions, how is this person who commits an evil action held accountable to God for their evil action?
I'm glad you said there's some good action.
Okay. But if God was using it, and would we say that would mean it's part of his plan if he uses it? Like, God's a lot more, I would say God is a lot more methodical than me. You know, I can be kind of just fly by the seat of my pants. Is that how God operates? It's kind of like, well, that happened. Here.
The only way,
High five. Hey, Gabriel, we did it.
the only way how I think that it would be unjust for man to be held accountable to his actions is if God controlled that person's actions. Just because he uses it, I don't think necessitates that they're suddenly righteous.
Right, but if it was part of his plan, I mean, can we say it's part of his plan?
Yes.
Okay, then a plan means a plan. It's what you wanted to happen.
Well, it's just like I can like if someone like let's say you have a child, which you do have a child,
Yes.
and let's say he consistently breaks things.
Which he does.
Which he
Okay.
does. And so he consistently breaks things. Because of that, you can plan that he's going to break stuff, and so therefore you buy things, toys that are not. I don't know. I can't.
Mhm.
You plan.
Let me know when you find those.
So it's.
And so his plan allows, or he knows that man is still going to sin. And like if he creates man and allows evil and thinks the depraved man, you know, then he knows that as they're going to sin. There's going to be evil. And God could have planned for man to be depraved by allowing evil.
But he planned for somebody to do something that would bring the evil into the world then.
Right, but like just like if Aslan continues to break things and you're planning for it to happen, it doesn't mean that breaking things is suddenly okay.
Okay, but if I'm okay, I see what you're saying there. Like, I'm planning to buy toys because I know Aslan's going to break them. So I'm planning to send my son because I know that even though it's not my first intention, man's going to fall.
Right, or like
What about evil in the course of history? I mean, where you have God telling Israel, if you disobey me, I'm going to send you into captivity. And then, how does he do it?
He uses. Not only that he uses the other nations.
Okay.
But then he also punishes the other nations for punishing Israel.
Right. What's up with that?
So it's kind of.
How does that work? Because they do something evil that God said God was going to do through them, and then God holds them accountable for what they did. Or you have Habakkuk look among, when he goes, Habakkuk's questions, and God goes, I'm doing something you wouldn't even believe. I'm raising up the Chaldeans.
Because just because. Hold on, let me get my thought. Hold on. Just because God is planning, God's plan. Just because. I have it up here. I need to get it out.
Mm-hmm.
Because just because God knows it's going to happen, so he does plan with it. But
So then God knows, but
God knows, but that still doesn't give them that justification of, so just because I was in God's plan for doing this doesn't mean the evil that I did.
so the Chaldeans, God just knew they were going to come. And then God said, I'm raising them up.
No.
And I'll send you into captivity.
So like God knows that man is depraved, and that God, like apart from God, man can do no good thing, or I don't know how the verse goes, something like that. With that, if
Yeah, but if they do something that God is using, like with taking Israel into captivity, and God says, I'm going to use them to do that. If Israel would have obeyed, that wouldn't have happened in this conditional covenant. But because they did disobey, God brought them.
I think
So the assumption is God wouldn't have done that if they would have obeyed. So if we're going to say, well, God knew they were going to do it,
well,
but
so it's like we're trying to figure out that God has like plan A and then plan B, and he's got like if they did this, then this, blah blah blah. He just like because he's outside of time and everything, he knows all the things that are going to happen at once, and when they all work together, like no unjust person is being exonerated, I guess. Nobody's being exonerated unjustly, and no one who deserves punishment or no one who's not deserving of punishment is being punished. If that makes sense. Like everything is still just, and yet that doesn't mean that he can't make good things happen out of them. Just because God planned to use someone evil doesn't mean that that person, because they still made that choice to be evil. They still made the evil act. And it's like just
Okay.
because of that doesn't mean that God can't.
I know, but if he's using it, that's the deal. If God's really using it. So what does Genesis 50:20 say? Did you guys even look at the verses?
Yeah.
Okay. So Joseph said, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." There's two intentions in their actions to Joseph. Evil and good. So if they did something and they meant evil, and yet Joseph can look at that hindsight and say, God meant it for good, to send me here to save many people's lives. What Joseph is implying is this whole thing God did. I don't know where the verse is, but then he also says, like, you didn't send me here, God did.
So pretty much, I mean, this is just like, which makes sense.
Okay,
So
then
what-
I'll just dodge it if it doesn't.
So whatever, like you were saying, the brothers didn't send them, but God did. So whatever evil, I can't articulate it. It's like,
Well, it makes sense that you can't. This is it's
So
a
it's-
complicated
so
subject.
whatever,
Let's go to the verses in Acts.
can we just say God works in mysterious ways?
He moves in mysterious. Well, you know that God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps on the sea and rides upon the storm.
That's all.
William Cooper. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. That's the story of Joseph, right? Acts chapter 4, let's go to chapter 2. Chapter 2, Peter preaching. He says here, Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, the man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know, him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God. You have taken by lawless hands and crucified. Why was Jesus delivered? Did God just know it was going to happen? Jesus said, nobody takes my life from me, but I lay it down.
So I guess can you restate your question?
Why was Jesus delivered?
So it's definitely
Plan of God. How did this plan take place?
With the help of the Lord.
Through wicked actions. Judas, Pilate, the Jews. Acts chapter 4, verse 27, verse 28. truly against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together. Look at verse 28. To do whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done. Determined. Okay, so who's involved here? Herod, the Gentiles, the Jews. What do? Kill Jesus. Pretty bad thing, I would say, right? Bad thing that God said he wanted. Why did they do it?
Because it was his heart, his will.
What does it say? What did they gather together to do? What does it say? Somebody read it.
Whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done.
Okay. Does that sound to you like God had a plan in a very specific way that he brought this about?
Yes.
I mean, your purpose, determining. Those are strong words in the Greek too, by the way. You could translate determined, predestined. So, we have no problem with that, right? God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. We love that. But what are the implications here, though? How are those guys held accountable then? Because he says they were gathered together to do whatever. He doesn't say, oh, they're off the hook because it was your plan. Peter doesn't say that in the sermon, does he? And this goes beyond just what we call quote-unquote evil actions. The question is God really in control of his world? And we have to face certain implications that come with that. And in my opinion, playing the free will card all the time is pointless. Because the Bible presents God as moving forward with this plan, making promises, making prophecies. Do men make free actions? Yeah, you see it. Are some of those free actions determined by God beforehand? At least some of them the Bible says that they are. Does that mean all are? I don't know. So the terms are sticky when we want to get too far, over here and say everything, God down to the minutest detail determined that rape and this and that. Although in judgments a lot of crazy stuff happened in the Old Testament, right? The flood, pretty gruesome if you take the flood to be real. But then you don't want to get so far on the other hand to where you go, well, God cannot do anything unless man cooperates. And that's the hang-up. That's our approach. God can't do it unless free will lets him. The Bible doesn't present that issue to where, oh, God's not going to intervene into your human will. Now, does the Bible say you need to make decisions and you're held responsible? Yeah. But the Bible presents God as the Alpha and Omega, working all things after the counsel of his will, accomplishing his purposes. And there's a whole lot of mystery. There's just a whole lot of mystery. Now, when you think of these guys like Judas and stuff, now do you think that God said to Pilate, look, I know you're all for Jesus. I get it. But look, I got this plan. And I know that you would prefer to worship him and get circumcised and become a Jew. But you see, I really want salvation to come to the world, and so what I need you to do, Pilate, is to actually do something you don't want to do. So you're going to do it. No. God didn't need to coerce Pilate's nature into doing something that was inconsistent with it. That's where the mystery is. Look at the prophecies that are fulfilled, all the things that are going on in the drama of redemption. Surely God is in control. And so when we ask these questions, you have to settle on, in my opinion, you have to settle on a framework that says God, in the mystery of his wisdom, had a purpose to allow evil. He had a purpose to allow it. He hasn't told us everything. Evil is against him, but yet he had a purpose to allow it. He had a purpose to allow the fall. I would say it like this, even though a lot of people would probably hate that. I would say God determined to allow the fall. It was part of his plan to allow it. Okay? It was part of his plan to allow his original intention for humanity to fall, because his greater intention is for a redeemed humanity. But although there's no verse in the Bible that I could think of that says redeemed humanity is better, but it is restored, and it will be better. So when you think about evil, I would say it like this. So God is not the author of evil. The Bible will say no. No way can you say that. Yet, God allows evil. If God is in control of the world, there's no way evil could be in the world except God has allowed it. Otherwise, we have not an omnipotent God. Okay? So, not only that, but God governs and directs the activities of evil sovereignly. If he's in control of evil, he determines how it can be expressed. Think of all the evil that God has actually restrained. You mean to tell me that he's not restraining Satan? So God not only allows evil, but he's governing it. He is directing it. He is using it. He decides the limits of evil's activity. And in the whole mystery of all that, he is using it. And he determined to use it. That's what you guys could disagree with me. This is what, you know what I mean? It's my class, final say, you know. He directs the activities of evil. Look, it's like this. You've got a dam, and here's the water. And I think that's a good expression, because water was chaotic and very, you know, evil, you could say, to the Semitic mind. So let's say that the water represents evil. What does a dam do? A dam restrains the water and then determines the direction of the water, where it can go, into the canals and so on, right? So the illustration would work like this. God, in his power and in his sovereignty, he's like the dam, that this evil that he has allowed can only go the places that he lets it go. Otherwise, you know, and not only that, so he's governing and directing it, but he's actually using it. And so if he lets it go somewhere, he doesn't do it flippantly, like, well, there's evil, I got to do something with it. He says, no, I actually have a plan for this. And beyond human comprehension, it is to bring about a greater good. Otherwise, Romans 8:28 makes no sense. So God is working all things after the counsel of his will. And God is using it to accomplish his plan. And to bring about good that brings him glory. And so it's not that God's like, well, there's evil, and I don't have a purpose for it, but I'm going to allow it. Rather, God is saying, I am allowing it in this situation for this reason, even if we don't get it. So God's relationship to evil is one of determining to allow it to happen in the mysterious process of letting Lucifer fall, then letting Adam and Eve fall, you know. And this isn't to poo-poo on anything you guys have said, but when I hear people go, yeah, but God wanted man to be able to make this free choice, and he put that potential thing, I'm like, but that doesn't absolve God. Is free will that important that God's going to allow all that just so that people could have free will? I mean, I just don't know. I go, well, God could have done something different. I don't know if free choice is that important to him, because that defines love. I don't know about that. You know, if I know that my son is going to do something in a certain situation and it's going to ultimately kill him, and I go, well, but I want him to be able to make that decision, because what matters to me is that he obeys me or doesn't obey me and experiences that consequences. I'm a horrible father, right? So trying to get God off the hook that way doesn't work. And where I've landed on is this. First of all, God is immensely sovereign, immensely good, completely good, and in absolute control of his world. And everything that he does with intention. And yes, some of it he does by permitting, but he has a purpose in that permission. And he has a purpose in that allowing. And God is constantly moving forward, and in the mystery of it all, using human actions, and our actions are real and meaningful. And this whole idea of God being in control, rather than making us scared of God, should empower us. But still, the implications when we want to get philosophical are heavy, aren't they? But when you look at the Bible has no qualms with God taking credit for evil things that happen, saying, I'm doing this. It doesn't make God evil. But that's why we got to begin with what we see in the Bible. And we see this complicated mixture of the two things. Real human choice, real human responsibility, but behind that, the invisible sovereign hand of God marching through human history, accomplishing his purposes. Not taking away from human choice at all. And it's much greater than human choice being completely independent. I'm not saying that free will doesn't exist, at least in some form. I'm just saying there's so much more. And that's not the one-all, end-all, whether or not we can say that. In my opinion, I think that creates just as many problems as every other view. That's why open theism exists, trying to defend God. So I say God has determined to permit things and to allow things, and he's moving forward. So I don't know how you guys feel about that, but you're going to have to do your own studies.
What about accountability? So still, the believers are accountable for their doing, or
Are people accountable?
yeah.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the Bible. That's all I'm doing. And what I see is that God's in control, and there's specific instances where you can see God said, that's going to happen because that's my plan. And it happens. And the person that does it, some of them have no idea. Like Cyrus. Did Cyrus have any idea he was fulfilling God's? So look at in Habakkuk. It's funny. In Habakkuk, you have the Chaldeans here. I know we've gone over, right? We do it every week. It's a problem in here. Habakkuk, where he's saying, I can't get there. Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, where are you? So he says this, look among the nations and watch, be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, even though it were told you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation which marches through the breadth of the earth. God says he's raising them up. Now he's allowing them. Same thing, okay? If he's raising them up, that means he could stop them. And so he says he does all this stuff. He's very, very, very successful in his campaigns. And then he says in verse 11, then his mind changes and he transgresses and commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. So God is using them and giving them victory, and then they go home and worship their pagan gods. So God is using people whether they know it or not.
The question is, if God used these, evildoers for His purpose in the plan, do you think is that just to punish them for what they did?
My answer is this: God, if God does it, yeah. He did it with Assyria. He did it with Judas.
Yeah.
And here's the deal: we just have to go. Let God be true and every man a liar. Like, I'm not trying to force some, hard theology. I've just always had a very strong view of God's sovereignty. And the Bible, like when Jesus says, if you want to talk about election, He goes, all that the Father give me will come to me, right? But then later on, He looks, He goes, so are you guys going to stay or what? He's like, your choice is real. I already know the Father's going to give me some, but are you going to stay? And so people are held accountable in the Bible for the evil they do. You know why? Because they want to do it. They want to do it.
So I guess, I understand. I guess the only question I have is, okay.
What about the book of Revelation? Sorry. If we take that literally, there's a lot of stuff that's going to be crazy. That God says that's His day of wrath. And that's pretty heavy.
Yeah, for the people who believe Bible, I think it doesn't, be a big issue. But for the rational mind.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah,
That's why all of these views are going to have philosophical challenges.
Yeah.
That's why philosophy has to bow to the authority of Scripture.
My question, I understand everything, but I guess the only question is, if somebody, I guess it's kind of like, how would you use that question and point it back to the gospel? If somebody, you're out witnessing to somebody, and they raise that question because that's just their honest.
Yeah.
They can't come to terms with that. My thing is, how can I use that and point them back to the gospel? I guess because that's.
I would say this. Look what God did to His Son, and His Son did willingly for you. Yeah, I mean the sins. There's a book by John Piper called Spectacular Sins. I haven't read it, but it looks at these massive sins that have shaped world history. Joseph and so on. But then you can go, Elisa. Sorry, we went over. Another one is the cross. I mean, what's more wicked than that? Killing God's Son. But yet, after the fact, they would say, they did whatever your hand and purpose determined before to be done. And why did God do it? To bring salvation.